I stood in the hallway, my hand still on the doorknob, not yet turned to step into the living room. Daniel's voice came from inside, low and tight, like he was holding himself back from saying something heavier. Oh, what froze me wasn't the tone. It was the language he was using. Korean. A language he thought I didn't understand. My name slipped out in the middle of the conversation. His voice dropped uneven, almost a whisper. She's not right for this family. I know. I'm trying. Please don't push me. I was frozen. A cold rush ran down my spine, not the kind you get when you catch someone cheating, but the kind that hits when the person you love talks about you in a way you never imagined. Daniel's voice didn't sound like betrayal. It sounded like someone backed into a corner, unsure where he was even allowed to stand. I held my breath and stepped back a few paces, trying not to make a sound. By the time he ended the call, I'd already turned around and walked quickly into the kitchen, pretending to wash my hands, the running water acting like a curtain hiding the chaos spinning in my head. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I focused on my breathing, trying to steady myself as Daniel walked in with a face so normal it was almost irritating. As if nothing had happened. As if the language barrier he used to hide from me was still perfectly intact. "You're here?" he asked, pulling open the fridge for a drink. "Yeah," I said, keeping my voice light. I didn't turn to look at him, afraid he'd see how my eyes had changed. I wasn't ready for any explanation, especially when I hadn't even figured out what I'd just heard. 2 years of marriage, long enough to understand each other, but short enough that there were still dark corners we hadn't touched. Daniel's family had kept their distance from me from the start. Not hostile, just cold and far. Whenever I asked, Daniel would say they just need time, the kind of vague answer he used anytime the topic was them. He never really opened up about his family, and I, with a kind of naive trust, thought that was normal. But now, after hearing what he said, I knew he'd been hiding something bigger. In my head, I saw the moment I first met his mother. She stood tall, rigid, sharp. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe like she was searching for a flaw tucked somewhere in the details. No smile, no warm greeting, just silent evaluation. When Daniel introduced me as his fiancée, her eyes only narrowed a little, like she was hearing that an employee was about to quit, not that her son was getting married. Back then, I told myself I was being too sensitive, but now the small memories started stitching themselves together in a way that made it hard to breathe. Daniel had no idea I once studied Korean. It was something I never thought I'd need to mention. I learned it in college, just because I liked it. Later, when I met him, the details slipped into silence. He never asked, and I never told. There was no reason. I didn't expect that tiny detail to become the line between the truth and what he'd been hiding from me. When I heard him say, "She's not right for this family," my heart didn't just hurt. It felt squeezed by a quiet fear. This wasn't the first time they talked about me like that. Maybe these conversations had been happening more than I ever guessed. Maybe Daniel had been standing between me and his family in silence for a long time, and I just never knew. He stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on my back like he always did. A familiar gesture, but tonight it carried a different weight. I felt the distance between his hand and my heart stretch farther than it ever had. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who were you talking to?" "Family stuff," he answered quickly, avoiding my eyes. A reply he'd used too many times. A reply that no longer felt harmless. I stared at the steam rising from the sink. I didn't know if what I'd heard was betrayal or a quiet battle Daniel had never been brave enough to let me see. And it was that uncertainty that squeezed the air out of me. When he set his glass down and walked out of the kitchen, one thing became painfully clear. I wasn't just doubting my husband. I was about to step into the part of the story Daniel had been trying to keep me from all along, and I had no idea if I was ready for the truth. From that night on, A small but obvious gap opened between Daniel and me, clear enough that I could almost see it. I didn't say anything about the call. He didn't ask why I was quieter than usual. We moved around each other like two people who both knew something was about to surface, but neither of us was brave enough to break the fragile calm. In the days that followed, strange signs started to show. Daniel went out more often, usually at times that didn't have any real reason behind them. He kept saying he had some family stuff to deal with, the kind of line that sounded like it had been rehearsed. His voice was too light, too steady, like he hoped that if he didn't shift his tone, I wouldn't notice anything was off. But I noticed. It wasn't because I suspected him. It was because I could feel the weight of whatever he was hiding. It slipped into every moment, every small movement he made. I found myself noticing more, even when I didn't want to. When he got a call, he walked farther away from me. When his phone buzzed, he flipped it face down. One time I stepped into his office and saw his screen go dark. A notification disappeared the second I walked in. Daniel froze for just a moment, only a second, but it was enough for me to see it. None of this looked like cheating. There were no signs of that kind of secrecy, no unfamiliar perfume, no romantic messages, no cold shift in the way he touched me. Instead, there was the sense that he was fighting something much heavier. I tried to calm myself. I didn't want to become someone who saw shadows everywhere, but every action of his carried the weight of a man cornered by something he didn't want me to see. Then one afternoon, I saw him receive an envelope. A man handed it to him at our front door, quick and stiff, like they didn't want anyone to notice. Daniel slipped it into his coat pocket before stepping inside. He didn't know I was standing on the stairs, watching from above. That night, I heard the sound of a drawer opening, the kind of sound someone makes when they're hiding something. When I walked in, Daniel jumped, too fast, too obvious. He forced a smile and said he was looking for a pen. But the way his eyes dropped to the drawer told a different story. What I felt wasn't suspicion anymore. It was fear. A kind of fear that made me press my hand against my chest just to keep myself steady. There was another night when I thought he'd already gone to bed, but he hadn't. I heard his voice in the living room. His voice was low and tired, like every word was being pulled out of him. Give me time. She doesn't know. I'm trying to make it work. I stood behind the door, barely breathing. Those broken pieces of sentences hit me like tiny pins. Not enough to understand everything, but more than enough to know I was at the center of a conversation I was never meant to be part of. Right then, a thought flashed through me, making my whole body go cold. That phone call wasn't about cheating. It was about me. The way he avoided things, the way he panicked at the thought of me hearing, the way his family kept their distance, the way he always said they were complicated. Every small detail, every uneasy glance, every vague movement started falling into place like the final pieces of a dark puzzle. If they were against me, why did Daniel let it drag on? Why didn't he take my side, at least in the privacy of our own home? He said he loved me, and I believed him. But love can't save a man who's too afraid to stand up to his own family. I lay in bed that night, listening to Daniel's steady breathing beside me. I turned to look at him in the dark. His face looked peaceful in sleep, but I knew better. That peace wasn't real. It was like a thin cloth draped over a wound still festering underneath. Part of me wanted to shake him awake and demand the truth. Another part was scared I wasn't ready to hear it. I remembered once, long ago, asking him why he never wanted me at family gatherings. He just smiled and said, "They're complicated. Trust me." And I did. But now, looking back, that line felt more like a door he kept locked in front of me. A door hiding the truth about his family and maybe the way they saw me. The conflict inside me kept growing. If they wanted to damage this marriage, why did Daniel let them? And more important, why did he choose silence instead of standing with me? One truth became clearer than anything else. I couldn't sit here waiting for him to handle family stuff anymore. The truth wasn't going to come on its own, and Daniel didn't seem ready to show me even a piece of it. I needed to know. I needed to understand what I was up against, and I couldn't do that by standing back and watching everything fall apart. In the end, I made a decision I never thought I'd make. I would follow him, not out of jealousy, not to catch him doing something wrong, but because I needed to know what I was losing and what I was trying to protect, and because my gut told me one thing with absolute clarity: the truth was right in front of me if I was brave enough to look straight at it. Following Daniel wasn't something I was proud of, but once I crossed that line, I knew there was no going back. I needed the truth, and the truth no longer lived in the words he chose to tell me. It lived in the silence, in the meetings he never mentioned, in the calls I wasn't allowed to hear. And that path led to a truth I was nowhere near ready for. One afternoon, Daniel left the house earlier than usual. I followed him, keeping enough distance not to draw attention. He parked in front of a small building where people rented meeting rooms by the hour. Not a restaurant, not a bar, not a place to meet friends. He walked in with tension carved into his shoulders. I waited a few minutes, then slipped down the hallway, trying to listen through the narrow gap by the door. When I heard the voices inside, my heart stopped. A woman's voice, cold, sharp. She didn't need a heavy tone for the power in her words to come through. Not a lover, not a young woman. There was no intimacy in that voice. I recognized it instantly. It was Daniel's mother. Her first sentence landed clean and hard. She's not from our culture. She won't fit. I froze in place, not out of surprise, but because it felt like a needle had struck the softest part of me. Her voice didn't lower. No whispering, no attempt to hide. She will never be accepted here. Each word hit my chest like a blow. I waited for Daniel to push back, to defend me. Just one line. But nothing came. His silence stretched on, heavy enough that it felt like someone needed to breathe for him. Then the next sentence. You need to choose the family, not her. Daniel's silence after that hurt more than any rejection could. I didn't hear him defend me. I didn't hear him stand up for our marriage. All I heard was the long exhale of a man being pulled back to a place he'd tried to leave and seemed powerless to resist. I stepped back, my hand grabbing the wall just to keep myself steady. Everything I'd imagined before, cheating, lies, hidden finances, none of it was true. The truth was worse, more personal, a truth that cut straight into who I was and whether I even belonged in his family. When I got home, it felt like I was carrying a different body, heavy, stiff, unfamiliar. I couldn't sleep. I picked up Daniel's phone, the one he'd forgotten in the living room. No new password, one small mistake in a web of secrets he wasn't alert enough to fully hide. In the voicemail box, I found several messages he hadn't deleted. His mother's voice, "You need to end it. She's not for us." His sister Mia's voice, soft but full of judgment. "She's too independent, too outspoken. She won't follow our way." Hearing the words "too independent" and "too outspoken" felt like another layer of my skin was being peeled away. The things I'd always been proud of, my honesty, my ability to stand on my own, were the very reasons they hated me. Then another message from his uncle. "We can't let her pull you away from the family." I started to understand. I wasn't just not a good fit. I was a threat, not to them, but to the control they had over Daniel. I set the phone down, but my hands were still shaking. I used to think I understood my place in this life, but it turned out I'd only been standing where they allowed me to stand, nothing more. The next day, I kept following Daniel. I didn't hope to find anything comforting anymore. I just wanted to see the whole picture, so nothing would stay blurred. In the parking lot behind the office building, I heard the call that tightened my chest. Daniel's voice, shaking but trying to stay calm. I don't want to lose her. A long silence. Then he spoke again, his voice catching in his throat. I just don't know how to fight you. I gripped the side of my car. My chest tightened. I wasn't being betrayed in love. I was being betrayed in silence. He loved me. I knew that. But he wasn't strong enough to stand between me and his family. He didn't betray me through his actions. He betrayed me by not having the courage to protect me from a pain he knew existed. And that broke me more than any affair ever could. The next day, I heard the darkest, deepest truth of all. His family met at a small restaurant. I sat at a table behind them, only a few steps away, listening to pieces of their conversation drift back to me. His mother said, "She'll leave on her own if we push the right buttons." His sister answered, "She already feels out of place. We just need to make it worse." Another voice added, "Create tension, make her feel unwelcome. She'll walk away." And then the final line, steady and cold. "We don't need to fight her. We only need to isolate her." I set my hand on the table, trying not to stand up. Not because I was afraid they'd see me, but because the truth that just came out had taken the breath straight out of my body. They didn't hate me. Not really. I was just the excuse, the tool they used to keep Daniel under their control. If it wasn't me, it would have been anyone who pulled him even an inch outside the mold they'd built around him since he was a kid. I was simply the first wall they needed to break to keep him in their shadow. When I stood up to leave the restaurant, my legs felt weightless, but my heart was heavy. I didn't know what my next step would be. I only knew one thing. The truth was clear. Painful, but clear. I went home after the family meeting they had no idea I witnessed. My body felt light, not because I was calm, but because it felt like I stepped out of a dark room Daniel never had the courage to show me. When I walked through the door, he was sitting at the kitchen table, fingers laced together. He looked up, eyes tired, unaware that in just a few seconds, every curtain between us would fall. I stood a few steps away from him, and for the first time since we met, I spoke to him in Korean. "Do you know how long it took me to understand all of this?" My voice was steady, each word sharp as a blade. Daniel froze. His pupils tightened. "Why, you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. His face went pale, like he'd just seen something impossible. His hands trembled, and in that moment, we both knew he understood that I'd heard everything. There was no way to dodge it now. No silence thick enough to hide behind. I pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Who have you been standing with this whole time?" Daniel lowered his head. His shoulders collapsed like someone who'd been carrying a weight for too long. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "I thought I could protect you." I let out a small laugh, but there was no joy in it. Protect me? By letting them talk about me like I'm nothing? By standing still while they push me out of your life? He closed his eyes, offering no defense, no resistance. And that silence hurt more than anything he could have said. The truth didn't need another word. He never protected me. He'd only been trying to keep a fragile, false peace so he wouldn't have to confront his family. He chose avoidance over standing with me. The next morning, Daniel said his family wanted to meet with both of us. A meeting to clear things up. He still didn't know I understood Korean. He didn't know how much I had already heard, but I agreed not to hear them explain, to end it. The meeting took place in a large living room, spacious and cold in both temperature and feeling. His mother sat in the center, her face calm to the point of emptiness. His sister, Mia, watched me with that same familiar judgment. The rest of the family spoke among themselves as if I wasn't even in the room. They started speaking Korean. They thought I didn't understand. They talked about me, right in front of me, like I was a piece of furniture sitting in the corner. She doesn't understand how things work here. She won't fit no matter how hard Daniel tries. This marriage was a mistake. Daniel stood frozen. He said nothing. He didn't step in. He just stared at the floor like an overgrown child who'd never escaped his family's shadow. I inhaled slowly and stood up. When I spoke Korean, my voice rang out steady and unmistakably clear, so unexpected that every face in the room snapped toward me. I understand every word you're saying. The whole room went silent. Daniel's mother froze, her face changing color within seconds. Mia's eyes widened, her lips parting but no words coming out. A few others exchanged panicked looks, as if I'd just broken some secret rule they thought I'd never discover. I took a step forward. No shaking, no backing down. The love between me and Daniel isn't something you get to control. It's not something you get to measure, test, or force into whatever shape your family wants. His mother pressed her lips together, holding back her anger. But I didn't stop. I won't accept being treated like an outsider in my own husband's life. No one has the right to put me in that position, not even you. Daniel looked at me, his eyes turning red. He had never seen me stand this firmly in front of his family, and he had never seen me speak their language, the language he believed would always be a wall between us. I turned to him and said the one thing I knew would cut straight into the softest part of him. I won't fight for a place you won't defend with me. Daniel's hands clenched tight, like I just struck the deepest part of him. That one sentence stripped away every layer he'd been hiding behind. There was nowhere left to run, no excuse left to believe. He broke down crying, not the kind of crying that comes from guilt, not the kind that comes from being caught, but the kind that comes from someone who's been suffocated by their own family for so long that they've lost themselves beneath all the expectations, demands, and invisible pressures. I watched him fall apart, every layer of defense collapsing in the very place where he should have been strongest. But I didn't move to comfort him. My hurt was too deep to patch him up in that moment. No one in his family said another word. Some avoided my eyes. Some looked ashamed. Some stared at Daniel with thinly veiled disappointment. But none of that mattered anymore. The meeting didn't end in reconciliation. It ended in truth. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and didn't wait for a single explanation or apology. The meeting room door closed behind me with a heavy final thud, sharp, clear, and absolute. Between me and his family, that door was a boundary. Between me and Daniel, it was a line between the weakest version of him and the man he would have to become if he wanted to keep this marriage. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my face, but somehow I felt lighter inside. Not because I'd won, not because I proved anything, but because I finally said the things that should have been said a long time ago. I left that meeting and spent a few days away from Daniel. I stayed in a friend's small apartment. No familiar sound of his footsteps, no scent of his coat, no suffocating silences pressing against me. I needed space to breathe, to listen to myself say what I'd been silent about for too long. I needed to know what I still wanted. Those days were light but quiet. I walked more, ate less, slept in fragments. But the distance made one thing clear. I wasn't afraid of losing Daniel. I was afraid of losing myself in his life. On the third day, Daniel came to find me. He stood at the door, not bowed, not timid, but not hiding his hurt either. There was one unmistakable change in his eyes. He wasn't shaking anymore. He wasn't avoiding. He wasn't shrinking into the boy his family had controlled for years. I talked to them, he began, his voice steadier than I'd ever heard it. I set boundaries, real ones. I looked at him, saying nothing. He went on, I choose you. Not because I'm afraid of losing you, but because I want a life that's mine, not theirs. For the first time, I saw a man standing in front of me, not someone crushed by his family's expectations, not someone who chose silence to avoid conflict, but someone who finally understood what he would lose if he kept bowing his head. Not lose me, lose himself. But I didn't go back right away. I needed to know this change wasn't just a moment of emotion. I needed to see him truly choose a new path. Not just stepping away from his family, but stepping away from the fear that had swallowed him for years. "We'll rebuild," I said, keeping my voice slow and steady. "Slowly. Honestly." Daniel nodded, like every word I said was a brick he needed to stand on. "If you want to be with me," I continued, "you have to grow out of the shadow they built around you. I can't love someone who's always being pulled back by voices that aren't his own." He exhaled, but it was the exhale of someone being freed. "I know. And I'm trying. For real this time." We didn't hug. The space between two people at the start of a new chapter needs respect and time. In the days that followed, Daniel showed me a change that was slow but real. He said no to his mother for the first time in his life. He turned down the high-pressure family meetings. He started therapy. He learned how to stand on his own without leaning on anyone. And I realized love isn't a battle for control, and it isn't a place where people compete to see who matters more. Love is where two people learn to stand strong beside each other, without either one shrinking to fit inside the other's shadow. I also understood something else, gentle but deep. My worth doesn't depend on his family's decisions. It doesn't depend on whether they accept me. My worth comes from the fact that I stepped out of the silence and said, "Enough." That afternoon, when I stepped out of the apartment, the sky was shifting from orange to purple. The cool air brushed my skin like a reminder that everything had changed. I didn't know if Daniel and I would ever be perfect. Maybe we wouldn't. But perfection was never the goal. I only knew one thing. I wasn't standing in the shadows someone else built anymore. I walked toward the evening light, feeling lighter, not because everything was healed, but because I finally chose myself first. And from that foundation, whatever we build next will be real, and it will last. In the end, I realized my worth was never tied to whether a family accepted me. It was in the fact that I stood up, set boundaries, and stepped away from anything that made me smaller. Real love doesn't come from control. It comes from two people strong enough to stand beside each other. Thank you for listening to this story. Your support means everything to me. If you'd like to follow my journey, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you again, truly.